Imagine you're standing in a Norse feasting hall in the year 850. The fire is roaring, the mead is flowing, and the most powerful man in the room just pulled out a knife, not to threaten anyone, but to pay his tab. He cuts a chunk off the silver ring on his arm, drops it on a set of tiny scales, and hands it over. That's what being rich looked like in the Viking Age, and it gets stranger from there. So this video is about what it actually meant to be wealthy in Viking society. Not the Hollywood version with horned helmets and gold coins, but the real thing. Because the reality is way more interesting than the myth. Most people assume Viking wealth looked something like medieval European wealth. Land, castles, maybe a crown. But it didn't work like that at all. The Viking economy ran on completely different rules, and once you understand those rules, everything about how they lived, how they showed off, and how they stayed powerful starts to make a lot more sense. We're going to go through some of the most surprising facts about what Viking wealth actually looked like in practice, and a few of them are going to genuinely change how you picture these people. Let's start with something that sounds almost too strange to be true. Wealthy Vikings wore their bank account on their arm. Literally. The Viking economy didn't run on coins the way most of the ancient world did. It ran on silver by weight. So when a rich Viking needed to pay for something, he didn't reach into a purse. He took a knife to the heavy silver ring on his arm, hacked off a piece, and weighed it on a set of small pocket scales he carried with him everywhere. The arm ring was his wallet, his savings account, and his credit card all at once. And you could make exact change by just cutting it smaller. Archaeologists have found thousands of these Hacksilver pieces across Scandinavia and the British Isles, chunks and slivers of cut-up rings that were used exactly this way. So the first thing to understand about Viking wealth is that it was physical, portable, and literally worn on your body. The more rings on your arms, the richer you obviously were to anyone looking at you. But here's where it gets really interesting, because where did all that silver actually come from? Not from Scandinavia. Not even primarily from raids on English monasteries, which is what most people picture. The main source of Viking silver was Islamic Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, based in what is now Iraq, minted silver coins called dirhams, and those coins flowed north in enormous quantities through a trade network that ran along the Volga River. Vikings would travel thousands of miles east and south, trading furs, amber, and enslaved people to Islamic merchants, and coming back loaded with Middle Eastern silver. Recent isotope analysis, basically chemical fingerprinting of metal, found that around a third of the silver in Viking hordes originated in the Islamic world. So when you picture a wealthy Viking showing off his arm rings at a feast, you're looking at someone whose fortune was built on a trade route stretching from Norway to Baghdad. That's not a raider. That's an international merchant operating on a scale that most people in medieval Europe couldn't have imagined. And speaking of slaves, this is something that tends to get left out of the popular image of Vikings, but it's central to understanding how their wealth actually worked. Thralls, enslaved people, were one of the primary measures of how rich you were. They weren't just labor, they were a status symbol, almost like a currency in themselves. The number of thralls you owned told everyone around you exactly where you stood. And those slaves were a key part of the trade network we just talked about. Vikings raided Ireland, England, and the Slavic lands for people, then sold them along routes stretching all the way to Constantinople and the Islamic world, exchanging them for the silver that formed the backbone of the Norse economy. Owning many thralls was the Viking equivalent of having a fleet of luxury cars parked outside your house. It was visible, it was understood by everyone, and it communicated power instantly. But the really fascinating thing about Viking wealth isn't just how you got it. It's what you were expected to do with it once you had it. A rich Viking's job was essentially to give his money away. The highest compliment you could pay a Norse leader was to call him a ring giver, meaning he was generous with his wealth to his followers. A jarl who hoarded silver wasn't admired. He was considered dishonorable and, honestly, dangerous. The whole social contract of Viking society ran through redistribution. You raided, you brought home silver, you feasted your warriors, you handed out arm rings, and in return they stayed loyal and kept fighting for you. The moment you stopped giving, you started losing. And losing loyalty in Viking society didn't just mean people stopped showing up. It could mean getting killed by the very men you'd stopped paying. So the pressure on wealthy Vikings wasn't to accumulate more, it was to keep circulating what they had. Wealth was a tool for building relationships, not a number to grow in isolation. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating ceremonies in Norse culture, and one that most people have never heard of. Being hoisted onto a shield by your warriors sounds like pure celebration, right? But it came with a direct financial obligation. The moment a Norse leader was raised on a shield, a formal ceremony of recognition, he was expected to immediately distribute gifts. Silver, weapons, arm rings. The ceremony was essentially a contract. Your men lift you up, you pay them. And refusing to distribute gifts after being raised on a shield would have been one of the most socially catastrophic things a wealthy Viking could do. You'd be breaking the agreement in front of everyone who mattered. So even moments of glory had a price tag, and the richer you were, the more expensive your celebrations became. Now, if you're enjoying this, stick around because the next few facts get even stranger. And one of them involves a burial mound in Norway that contains fabric from the other side of the known world. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway and dated to 834 AD, is one of the most remarkable archaeological finds in Viking history. It's the grave of an elite Viking woman, and inside, along with a ship, tapestries, and carved wooden furniture, archaeologists found fragments of silk. Not just any silk, silk woven in Central Asia and the Byzantine world, thousands of miles away. For a wealthy Viking woman in 9th century Norway to own Central Asian silk is roughly equivalent to someone today wearing a garment that had been handmade on another planet. The supply chains required to get that fabric from Central Asia to a Norwegian burial mound are almost incomprehensible by the standards of the time. And yet there it was. If you needed a single object to prove how connected the Viking world was to the rest of the globe, that silk is it. And then there's something that might be the most practical and brutal aspect of Viking wealth: the ability to literally buy your way out of being killed. Viking law had a concept called Wergild, which translates roughly as man price. Every person in Norse society had a fixed monetary value based on their social class. If you killed someone, you could avoid a blood feud, which could go on for generations, by paying the victim's family the correct amount of silver. A jarl's life was worth significantly more than a farmer's, and a thrall had almost no value at all. Rich Vikings could afford to pay Wergild and walk away from killings that would have destroyed a poorer family entirely. Wealth was quite literally the difference between life and death under Viking law. A rich man could commit an act that would ruin a poor man forever, hand over some silver, and carry on with his life. That's a level of legal inequality that's uncomfortable to sit with, but it was the reality of how the system worked. Now let's talk about what a wealthy Viking's home actually looked like, because this one surprises most people. Elite Viking longhouses found archaeologically can stretch over 80 meters in length. That's longer than a modern football pitch. The largest were essentially feasting halls capable of hosting hundreds of warriors at once. And the size wasn't just about comfort, it was your CV. Every visitor who walked in immediately understood how many men you could feed, how much livestock you kept, and how powerful you were. Building a bigger hall than your rival was a deliberate act of social competition. It was the Viking equivalent of building a taller skyscraper than the guy across the street. The hall was your statement to the world, and wealthy Vikings invested enormously in making that statement as loud as possible. But here's something about wealthy Viking appearance that's genuinely unexpected. Rich Vikings bleached their hair. Blonde hair was highly prized as a status marker in Norse culture, and wealthy Viking men, particularly those with naturally darker hair, used a strong lye soap made from ash and animal fat to lighten their hair and beards. The same substance used for cleaning was applied at higher concentrations to bleach hair. This was not a comfortable process. Lye is caustic. It can burn skin. But it also killed lice, which meant elite Viking grooming was simultaneously a beauty treatment and a medical procedure. So the image of the golden-haired Norse warrior isn't entirely myth. It's just that some of them were paying for that look in a very painful way. If you want more videos like this, weird, specific, genuinely surprising history that most channels don't cover, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, and it's worth sticking around. Drop a comment below with the fact that surprised you most, because I'm genuinely curious which one lands hardest. And we'll end on something that I think is the most quietly haunting detail in all of Viking history. Wealthy Vikings buried their silver underground for safekeeping. No banks, no vaults, just a hole in the ground somewhere only you knew about. Thousands of these hoards have been found across Scandinavia and the British Isles. And the reason we find them today is simple. A significant number of the people who buried them never came back. Killed in raids, dying unexpectedly, never making it home. The Kurdale hoard, found in England, contained over 8,600 items of silver. Nobody ever came back for it. Every hoard archaeologists dig up today is a wealthy Viking's savings account that their family never got to access. All that silver, all that status, all those arm rings and Hacksilver and Islamic dirhams, just sitting in the ground waiting for someone who never returned. So here's what's actually remarkable about all of this. Viking wealth wasn't passive. It wasn't something you sat on. It was a living, moving, socially demanding thing. You wore it, you cut it, you gave it away, you used it to pay for lives you'd taken, you buried it in the ground and hoped you'd make it back. The richest Vikings in history were connected to Baghdad, dressed in Central Asian silk, living in halls the size of sports fields, and bleaching their hair with caustic soap to look the part. That's not the Viking Age most people picture, but that's the one that actually existed.